What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the early slate version of the Ship My Money show for May 15th. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we're back for two different shows today after needing to miss yesterday's. Apologies if my voice sounds worse than usual, but should be good to go today. Only 6 games on the early slate, so it should be a pretty quick show as well. As always, give the video a thumbs up, comment, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. And we're going to just jump right into it. We have the Pirates taking on the Milwaukee Brewers in Milwaukee. So it's a good hitter's park. Nice park upgrade for the Pirates. They are taking on the Brewers rookie, making his second start, Robert Gasser. Martin Perez is on the mound for the Pirates. So not particularly interested in the pitching here. With it being a 6-game slate, Gasser does have some appeal. Decent matchup against the Pirates. They do have a pretty low implied run total. The problem is that he's $8,600. He projects to be a solid major league pitcher. He's not a elite strikeout pitcher or anything like that. But on a 6-game slate, he's still going to look decent here. Looks like a secondary option. Getting about 11% ownership. Showed up in about 13 to 14% of the lineups I built. So I'm pretty much in line with the field as far as where I think he should be rostered versus where he is projected to be rostered. On the other side, Martin Perez, just not a good strikeout pitcher at all. Never really has been, and that's not changing as he gets any older. So he's much more difficult to get to. It's not like he is free or anything at 7,400. So I don't anticipate getting to too much of him. 6% of the lineups I built have him. He's projected for 1% ownership. Pretty low probability play there. From a stacking standpoint, the Pirates and Brewers both showing up in the middle of the pack in terms of all stack types. 5-man stacks, you get the Pirates actually jumping up quite a bit. I'm assuming that this is a function of salary and them being a pretty easy team to 5-man stack. It does also in tournaments make some sense just because Gasser is getting around 10% ownership. That's not something that's factored into these numbers, though. So that has nothing to do with why the Pirates jumped up as far as 5-mans. Milwaukee kind of held their spot in the middle of the pack. Individually, I would expect that we're getting to right-handed Pirates pretty frequently. Andrew McCutchen, 4,200, looks pretty good. O'Neal Cruz is left-handed, but is a high upside shortstop option. He's reasonably priced at 4,700, so I like that as well. William Contreras going up against Perez looks good. Nice catcher option, high upside bat against a pitcher that doesn't miss a lot of bats in a park that doesn't limit power. Does set up as a pretty good spot for the Brewers, even though they are a bit more expensive. So far this season, only a 152 expected ISO allowed to righties for Perez, but he does have a 357 expected WOBA allowed. If you go back to last year, it's a 177 expected ISO. So again, doesn't miss a lot of bats, doesn't typically give up a ton of power, but doesn't limit it that well either. Joey Ortiz as a value option with MPE is going to look pretty good. Christian Yelich, lefty is fine. Then we get back to another right-handed Pirates bat with Connor Joe. Willie Adames from the right side for the Brewers. Overall, it just looks like a pretty solid game offensively for both of these teams. And again, you do get a little bit of added leverage going to the Pirates since they are facing a 10% owned pitcher. Next, we have the Miami Marlins taking on the Detroit Tigers. Casey Mize is on the mound for the Tigers. Trevor Rogers going for the Marlins. And this really speaks to the quality of pitching on this slate. Casey Mize is $7,200, projected for 29% ownership. This is not a good strikeout pitcher, but he is facing the Marlins. The game is in Detroit. He only showed up in 11% of the lineups I built. Decent chance that number comes up a bit by the time we get to lock. Usually when there's a discrepancy that big between ownership projection and how often a player is showing up for me, one of those two numbers changes as final lineups come in. But if Mize's ownership does hold around 30%, I do think there's a good chance that it's a little bit higher at least than I would like, given that he is just simply not a good strikeout pitcher at all. Obviously the matchup is good, but 16% K percentage for Mize this year. Does have a 3.97 xFIP, which is solid. I did bet over 4.5 strikeouts for him at plus 130 this morning. So I recognize it's a good matchup, but from a DFS standpoint, I do think he's going a little bit over-owned if that ownership holds. Trevor Rogers on the other side, not getting any ownership, showed up in 7% of the lineups I built. So again, probably going under-owned if he is truly 1%. He's probably closer to like 3, but still a low probability play. He's shown some signs of upside in the past, but so far this year, 17% K percentage, 4.28 xFIP, allowing about 1.2 home runs per 9 innings. Just doesn't seem like a great option, although if you're going to have a slate where Casey Mize is truly 30% owned, then any cheap pitcher is viable basically, because it's not like they're generally worse at getting strikeouts than Casey Mize, and they're just a lot lower owned. But other than ownership considerations, he's not going to look particularly good. The Tigers, not really showing up great as far as stacks go. Miami actually coming in a little bit higher, which is a little surprising to me since Mize has actually been good at run prevention this year. The issue is just the strikeouts, but Miami is generally pretty favorably priced. So I think that's one reason you would see them showing up. Chisholm is actually good at 5,100. I have no issues with that individually or as part of a mini stack. Since the start of last year, 182 expected ISO to lefties for Mize. Same number this year with a 328 expected WOBA. So Jazz Chisholm is going to look good. Jake Berger is reasonably priced. He does have power. Mize has held righties to about a 100 expected ISO this season. And I forgot he didn't pitch last year. So, of course, same number this year as last year. But point stands, he's been really good at limiting right-handed power so far. Not as good at limiting left-handed power, which is just what you would expect. Jesus Sanchez, 3,600, I think looks interesting as well. The problem is just that it's so difficult to hit home runs in this park. The Tigers are pretty affordable too. Andy Ibanez hitting second. We do have this lineup. Ibanez hitting second with MPE at 3,400 is going to look pretty good. Again, Trevor Rogers just not that good of a pitcher since last season, where Rogers was also injured for part of it. 16.8% K percentage to righties, the 193 expected ISO, 358 expected WOBA. Those numbers haven't changed much this year. Again, most of that sample was also driven by this year, but it's not like he's been particularly good at getting righties out. So you have Ibanez, you have Vierling, you have Kana, you have Urshela. These guys are all in the top five. The only one of them above $4,000 is Kana at 4,800. Perez, 4,300 is reasonably priced as well. Spencer Torkelson, we know has some power. He just has had trouble putting it together at the major league level so far, but this is a pretty affordable stack. I'm surprised that they're not showing up more in the lineups that I built, because at least on paper, to me, it makes sense that you have a pretty cheap team. Yeah, the park's not great, but you have a pretty cheap team with right-handed bats going against a not very good left-handed pitcher. I'm surprised they're not showing up a little bit more. I think they look perfectly fine. Next, we have the Nats taking on the Chicago White Sox in Chicago. We did not get this game yesterday because of the doubleheader. It wasn't on the slate. But today we have Garrett Crochet on the mound for the White Sox. We have Patrick Corbin going for the Nats. Not surprisingly, Garrett Crochet is getting a ton of ownership. Patrick Corbin is not. Crochet is a really, really, really good strikeout pitcher. Highest strikeout percentage on the slate at 34.2%. Only walking 4.8% of hitters this year, which is a big thing for him. You know, one of the bigger question marks with him moving to a role as a starter is, one, how well is his stuff going to carry? Is it still going to play up like it did as a reliever? But also, are the walks going to be an issue? Is he going to be able to go deep enough into games, or is he just going to be striking out or walking everyone? And so far, he is striking everyone out, but he's not walking them. So that's been really good to see. Really like him here. The Nats aren't a great strikeout team, but Crochet is a great strikeout pitcher. And we've already talked about somebody like Casey Mize getting ownership on this slate. So, I mean, I'd rather go to Garrett Crochet. I don't know about you. Patrick Corbin on the other side, he's just another one. He's in this Trevor Rogers bucket, Martin Perez bucket, where he's projected to be under-owned in the sense that he's getting no ownership and somebody like Casey Mize is getting a lot. I think it's likely that you see those two ownership projections balance out a little bit. But one way or the other, if you want to play a $6,200 Corbin in large field tournaments and just hope to run good, fine. But the dude is not good at pitching. The matchup isn't horrible against the White Sox, but outside of that, it's really tough to make any sort of case for Corbin, that and the salary. 14.8% K percentage. He does only have a 4.25 xFIP. So from a run prevention standpoint, he hasn't been terrible. Like, that's the argument that I would make, really, is right now. And again, I do think these numbers are somewhat likely to change, but right now, Casey Mize projects for like 30% ownership. Patrick Corbin projects for none. This season, Mize, 16% K percentage. Corbin just shy of 15. Mize, 3.97 xFIP. Corbin just shy or at 4.25. So that clearly, I understand that, like facing Miami is maybe better than facing the White Sox. But these are pretty similar pitchers in terms of what they offer you, even if you are willing to say that Mize is a little bit better, which I am. So I do think that's something to pay attention to. And again, the same can be said for Rogers, same can be said for Martin Perez. That's why I do think that you see that Mize ownership come down a little bit, and those guys probably creep up. But that feels also like way too much time talking about Patrick Corbin. Offensively, White Sox coming in near the bottom as far as stacks go, but I do think it's important to point out that you have Cincinnati up here at the top, and then there's a little bit of a drop to the Padres, and then it's like every team on the slate other than the Rockies just lumped together. So I don't think you should just look at the White Sox at the bottom and say like they're a bad stack. They are a pretty similar stack to most other teams on the slate. If you look at 5-mans, it's pretty similar. The third highest stack here is coming in at 6%. The White Sox are fourth from the bottom at 3%. These stacks are pretty much interchangeable for the most part. Individually, we have Tommy Pham coming in the most frequently in the lineups that I built. He's projected for about 18% ownership. So it looks like he will be popular at 4K. Good price tag for him. Andrew Vaughn, only 2,900, looks really good against Corbin. Again, he just doesn't miss bats, and we know that Vaughn has home run power. It's just a matter of hitting the ball. Corbin only a 15% K percentage to righties since the start of last year. 208 expected ISO, 377 expected WOBA. The expected power numbers are a little bit better this year at 168, but still a 370 xWOBA to righties. I think Andrew Vaughn looks really good. Field seems to agree with about 16, 17% projected ownership. Then you just get other cheap White Sox bats. If Brian Ramos is in the lineup, he is inexpensive. Eloy Jimenez, only 3,900, is going to look solid. The Nats look fine also. I'm a little surprised they're showing up as much as they are. I think this probably comes down to, I don't get why the Nats are showing up how they are. It's a terrible matchup against Crochet. They don't have a high implied run total. CJ Abrams is really good, and the Nats in general are really cheap, but I just don't really think that carries that much weight on this slate. Now, if you wanted to make the argument that the Nats are a good large field tournament stack, because teams have gotten to Crochet at times this year, it is baseball, random stuff happens, and if you happen to get a good stack against the 50% owned pitcher, that's really good, but that's not necessarily being factored in completely, to these lineups. That's something that tends to show up at the end of my lineup building process. So I'm a little surprised how often, actually more than a little surprised how often the Nats are showing up here. The field's not getting to them. They're coming in very under-owned for me, which concerns me because they're not a team that I actually would really want to stack, but I do pretty much always just roll with whatever my process spits out. I'm hoping that ends up not being the Nats, but it looks like it might be. I think the only actual argument for them is that Crochet is really popular. It's a good park to hit in. It's a small slate. But other than that, it's a really, really bad spot for Washington. Next, we have the Reds taking on the Diamondbacks in Arizona. Not a great park to hit in, but both of these offenses have relatively high implied run totals. Brandon Pfaadt on the mound for Arizona. We have Andrew Abbott going for the Reds. Both pitchers priced between 7 and 8K. Neither one getting much ownership. Pfaadt, I think, maybe gets a little bit more. They probably both come up a little bit. I'm wondering if I had something just wrong in my ownership that I ran before the show, because these guys shouldn't be as low owned as they are, I don't think. But either way, Brandon Pfaadt, 7,600, Andrew Abbott, 7,800. With the pitching on this slate, I think they look fine. They look like secondary options to me, but nothing that really stands out. There is some strikeout upside. Abbott so far this season has struck out 20.8% of hitters. In previous years, he's had a little bit higher strikeout percentage. Brandon Pfaadt hasn't been great since coming up to the majors. 21.1% K percentage this year. Does have a 3.66 xFIP, which is nice. He does typically struggle with left-handed bats, so I think that sets up pretty nicely for Cincy, just with the way that their roster is constructed. They are showing up a lot as far as stacks go. Elly De La Cruz is in a pretty nice spot. Pfaadt, since debuting last year, 192 expected ISO to lefties. 336 expected WOBA is reasonable, but he does give up power. You have De La Cruz, who has tons of it and will be hitting from his better side of the plate from the left side. We have Will Benson, 3,800. Good price tag, has some power there. Mike Ford is very cheap at 3,300, likely hitting at the top of the order. Stevenson, I've mentioned a bunch this year, only has like a 97 WRC plus the last I looked, but he's been among the league leaders in barrels per plate appearance and barrels per batted ball event this year. So I think you do see that production increase. Candelario is cheap. It's just a nice value stack for the Reds, in addition to a decent matchup against Pfaadt. So that's why you're seeing those stacks show up as often as you are. On the other side, Arizona, their matchup's not bad either. It's a similar matchup where Abbott has talent. When he's on, he can be really tough to hit, but he is relatively inconsistent. He will give up some power. Since last year, 182 expected ISO to righties. But the difference is that the Diamondbacks are quite a bit more expensive. So Ketel Marte coming in at 5,300. He looks good. Field's projected for about 21% right now. But, you have him at 5,300. You have Carroll at 5K, Walker at 4,900. It gets a little bit more difficult to fully stack the guys that you want from the Diamondbacks because of those salaries. But if you can make it work, then works well. Somebody said there's an ownership update. You don't know what ownership I'm using, so I don't know how you would know that. Kansas City taking on Seattle. In Seattle, so great pitcher's park. Brian Wu, 8,400 for Seattle. Alec Marsh, 8K for Kansas City. We know that going up against Seattle has basically been a cheat code. Alec Marsh isn't a very good strikeout pitcher. He is 8K, so I have a hard time wanting to get here. He did show up more for me than he's projected to show up for the field. I get it. Seattle strikes out a lot. This is really pushing the limit as far as like how far I can go recommending a pitcher just because they're facing Seattle. Like, this offense does have talented hitters. They've just been striking out a ton. They will continue to strike out a lot, but you're talking about an 8K pitcher that has an 18.5% strikeout percentage this year. It is a good park and all of that, but I think I'm not quite as on board with how much he showed up here personally, just given the price tag. Brian Wu does have a more difficult strikeout matchup against KC. Still a great park to pitch in. And one thing to keep in mind with Kansas City's strikeout percentage for the year, when you look at park factors for strikeouts, Kauffman Stadium is, I believe, the most difficult strikeout park. If not, it's like bottom 3 in baseball. Seattle is the best strikeout park. So that's something to keep in mind when you're just looking at raw strikeout numbers. Is that Kansas City is, like, if they played every game in Seattle, they would naturally strike out more than they do. Not to say that they're a high strikeout team. They wouldn't just suddenly turn into the Mariners, but they would strike out more than their numbers if you just look straight up at strikeout percentage. So Brian Wu at 8,400 looks fine here. Projected around 25% ownership, 18% of the lineups I built have Wu. I think he looks perfectly fine. I don't anticipate getting to either offense here, but again, I wasn't anticipating getting to the Nats either. But we have Seattle showing up towards the bottom. We have Kansas City, middle of the pack as far as stacks go. Again, they're all just kind of lumped together. 5-mans, you get KC moving up a little bit. Probably just Bobby Witt driving things up. He tends to do that. Seattle is still toward the bottom. Again, I kind of like the idea of Seattle just because Marsh doesn't miss a lot of bats himself, and Seattle does have power. Marsh has a 195 expected ISO allowed to lefties since last year. It is only 150 this year. He has made some improvements, but like, I personally can make a case for Seattle, but they're not really showing up that much. It is obviously very difficult to hit home runs in this park, so maybe that's why they're not showing up more. Bobby Witt looks really under-owned to me. I don't have any issues with that. That's one of the few things we've gotten to so far where I'm getting a lot and the field's not projected to, and I'm happy about it. He is expensive, but it's Bobby Witt Jr. He's really, really good. Brian Wu is a solid young pitcher, but he's not a pitcher that I'm like terrified of taking hitters against. He just hasn't. Not a big enough sample that I'm, running away from Bobby Witt against him. Julio Rodriguez is projected for ownership. He is not showing up as much for me, but he is still showing up a pretty good amount. Salvador Perez, Vinny Pasquantino, these guys you can see kind of just driving up those Kansas City stacks, and then you're just rounding things out with value. Cal Raleigh, I do like as a catcher. Pretty much always like him because he's always affordably priced because of playing his home games in Seattle, but he also gives you more just raw power than most catchers do. So I do always like the idea of getting to Cal Raleigh. Finally, we have the Colorado Rockies taking on the Padres. The Rockies are somehow winning games recently. I don't care. They're still terrible. They're going to start losing constantly again soon. Mike King is going for the Padres at $8,800. He is projected for an absolutely absurd amount of ownership at nearly 70%. He also showed up in 63% of the lineups I built. So I say absurd ownership in terms of the raw numbers. I obviously don't have too much of a problem with it. He's in 2/3 of the lineups that I built. Austin Gomber on the other side, really, really tough matchup against the Padres. It is a good pitcher's park, but this team doesn't strike out a lot. They have good hitters. Austin Gomber also not very good at pitching, so there's also that. But Michael King, the only argument I think you're really making against him is just an ownership argument. In large field tournaments, if you just want to say, I'm going to grab one of these lower-owned other pitchers that isn't 70% owned, hopefully they beat King because it's baseball and, King's range of outcomes is still extremely wide. Everybody's is. Then I think that's perfectly fine. But he does just look like a clear top play. The Rockies are absolutely awful. On top of that, they get one of the biggest park downgrades you can get, playing in Petco instead of in Coors. So that all looks good. It just matters, kind of what offenses are you playing. Like, for example, if you're playing just using the Nats because that's a team that I unfortunately have a feeling I'll be using. If you're using the Nats, there's no real reason not to be going to Michael King in a pretty high percentage of your lineups. If you're playing, I don't know, whoever else was popular, like Arizona, the Reds, teams like that, then yeah, you probably want to be looking somewhere else. But he's clearly one of the top pitchers on the slate. It does not matter whatsoever that the Rockies have won like 6 in a row. Could not care less. Does not matter. Has nothing to do with them winning today. So yeah, it really just comes down to roster construction for King. From a stacking standpoint, the Padres look good. The park sucks. Otherwise, they would look better. But one of the better matchups on the slate, Austin Gomber, just not a very good pitcher. Obviously, you expect him to be better outside of Coors than inside of Coors. But since last season, 190 expected ISO to righties, 348 expected WOBA. Lefties hit him well too, though, is the problem. 259 expected ISO to lefties, 394 expected WOBA. We don't have a Padres lineup yet, at least that I know of. But clearly, Fernando Tatis, Manny Machado, Campusano, those guys are going to look good. Xander Bogaerts, Song Kim, whatever righties in this lineup are going to look good. But if Cronenworth is in there, if Merrill is in there, if Arise is in there, don't sleep on these guys because Austin Gomber has actually been worse against lefties. And even if you want to assume that over a larger sample, it balances out, he is very clearly not good against them. So I think really any Padres in this lineup look like pretty good plays. The Rockies on the other side are the Nats. They're the Nats, but like Michael King's not as good as Garrett Crochet. There's more talent on the Nats, though, so it kind of evens out. Like, I would rather, if you put the Nats against Michael King, I would actually like the way the Nats were showing up for me in the lineups I built because you're just getting some solid hitters. CJ Abrams is a stud, and Michael King is fine, but not great. 25.6% K percentage, 3.89 xFIP so far this season, but 1.84 home runs per 9. He does give up power. Lefties have a 166 expected ISO against him. Righties are at 222. So you at least have that, whereas Crochet is just an absolute stud. But the problem here is that, like, Ryan McMahon's pretty good. And other than that, the Rockies suck and this park sucks. So it's tough for me to make play the Rockies case other than if the Rockies do light up Michael King and you have them, not only do you have a low-owned team with basically no ownership projected across the board, but you're only competing with 30% of the lineups that entered because the Michael King lineups are dead. So that's the case for the Rockies in large field tournaments. Even like mini stacking them in smaller field stuff, because smaller field stuff, obviously you don't have to beat as many entries, but you're probably going to see even higher ownership on King. Like if he's actually 65% owned in large field, he's probably 75, 78, 80% in small field. So you can just like mini stack against him, grab McMahon, grab Blackman, and hope that they get to King, and then you beat him with some other pitchers. But outside of the game theory approach there's not a lot pointing to the Rockies because the park's not very good, King is good, and the Rockies as a whole are not good. So those are the six games on the early slate. To recap, my favorite pitchers are Garrett Crochet, Michael King, and then kind of shrug. I think Fod, Wu are pretty similar, and then there's just like a bunch of garbage. I want to pay attention to what ends up happening with Casey Mize ownership because right now, like if the slate started right now, my expectation would be that I'm just playing more Marsh, more Gasser, more Fod, more Abbott, and less Mize. But I do also think that ownership probably ends up coming down by the time we get to lock. Favorite hitters, Ellie De La Cruz, absolutely love him here against Fod. Really like Fernando Tatis against Gomber. Neither of those obviously going out on a limb. Will Benson for value looks good. So I like those three. Home run call, I'll go with Contreras for a home run, just in the good park in Milwaukee against the pitcher that's going to allow him to put the ball in play. And then finally, top stacks. A lot of teams that look really, really similar. The Reds showing up the most for me. I think I slightly prefer the Padres personally, but yeah, Reds, Padres look the best. A bunch of teams lumped together. I do like this Milwaukee game. I think there's a nice combination of value and a good hitter's park against not great pitching. So I would say that that's the game that kind of isn't showing up as much in the lineups I built, but once I finish, once I go through my whole process and I enter lineups, if I were getting to Milwaukee and Pittsburgh, I'd be pretty happy. Now, that being said, that's how I felt about the Houston-Oakland game yesterday, and they scored 3 runs combined. So, it is what it is, but I think that's kind of a game that's maybe not getting quite as much attention as it should. So that's what I have for the early slate. I will be back at 5 p.m. for tonight's main slate. We'll go through same thing, game by game there. Einsteinium said any contrarian pitchers you like for single entry. It kind of depends. Like I said, I think ownership was kind of wonky when I ran it before the show. So I don't feel like I have a good feel right now for who is actually popular. But I think the way that I would sum up pitching right now as far as contrarian goes, Michael King should be very popular. Garrett Crochet should be very popular. Brian Wu should be popular. Not to the same extent as King and Crochet, but he should be popular. Other than that, if anybody from Fod, Marsh, Gasser, Mize, Abbott, Rogers, if any pitcher not named King, Crochet, or Wu is pulling substantially more ownership than the rest of the pitchers in that range, that is a pitcher that I would like to pivot away from and play literally anybody else in that range. So I think it's King, clear 1, Crochet, or King and Crochet, clear 1, 2. You can rank them how you want. Based on salary, I think it's King. But King and Crochet, 1, 2. Wu, clear 3. And then everybody else is kind of just like there. And I don't think any of them should be getting massive ownership. So for a contrarian pitcher in single entry, I would say I'm not actively looking to get away from just 2 of King, Crochet, Wu. But if you were, just grab a low-owned pitcher that is in that other group of guys. So thanks again for checking out the show. Hit the thumbs up button on your way out. I'll be back at 5 Eastern. Same show, different games. Thanks again. Good luck today.